Hi, everybody, and welcome back. Today we're going to talk about generating alibi statements. So we've already talked about kind of generally what an alibi is, the alibi taxonomy, and kind of how the literature started to develop. Today we're going to talk about how individuals and how suspects might actually generate an alibi statement. So we're going to look to Richard Rosario here. Richard was accused of murder in the state of New York, and he told the police he had never met the victim, and in fact, he was in the state of Florida at the time in question. He had 13 alibi corroborators state that he was in Florida, including one woman who remembered being with him the day she went into labor, right? So obviously a very robust memory. I remember exactly where I was when my water broke, and Richard Rosario was there. But the police never investigated the claim, and the defense attorney did not do an adequate job of highlighting the 13 alibi corroborators that Rosario actually had. And so, and this is just another example of a wrongful conviction that happened as a result of an unbelieved alibi. So alibi claims are actually a common defense, right? For obvious reasons, right? You can't be in two places at once. So it's one of the best defenses you could actually possibly have in court, right? Hey, I couldn't be there because I was here. Here's evidence I was here. However, there's decent literature to suggest that alibi use in court could backfire. And this is well before even the 2004 piece. In 1929, there's literature to suggest an alibi witness can be effectively discredited if he's testifying falsely and goes into too much detail in narrating the facts, right? So if you go, the more detail you provide, the more detail you give the other side to try and disprove your claim, and therefore discredit the alibi. In 2020, Steele suggested that an alibi is a risky gambit with a high likelihood of backfiring. And the reason for this high likelihood of backfiring is due to cross-examination risks. And so a lot of attorneys, defense attorneys, are very, very hesitant to actually produce an alibi or put their client on the stand and have them testify about an alibi because of cross-examination risks, right? And you also can't just put your client on the stand to just talk about one aspect of the crime. You're opening them up to the entirety of what possibly happened. And so basically the suggestion is you might not want to use alibis because there's a tremendous risk associated with using them. So what does it mean to generate an alibi? Right? Basically, it just means to remember what you were doing on a certain day and time, right? At its most basic level, alibi generation is just a memory test, right? But we also know from the eyewitness literature that memory is not great, right? The memory needs to be encoded, it needs to be stored, and it needs to be retrieved accurately and well, right? We know that memory is prone to a variety of errors, as we've already talked about in previous lectures. And so in the legal system, though, remembering it, which is hard enough, still isn't enough. You now have to prove it and legally prove it, right? What's very odd is this is despite the fact that you are innocent until proven guilty. So even though the court suggests an alibi should be believed, even though jurors are told you should believe the alibi unless the prosecutor proves otherwise, the default is we're not going to believe the alibi until you prove it to us, which is problematic in practice. So the taxonomy tells us of different types of person evidence, right? However, Sharman et al. Shows that most believable evidence, non-motivated strangers, have a difficult time remembering innocuous interactions, right? Let's say you know for a fact, I could not have committed that crime because I was at this restaurant. I will probably be able to remember who my waitress is. Let's go back to the restaurant and see if I can find her. Why is she going to remember you, right? You are a very innocuous kind of person to her also. You're just one of several tables that she had that night. Sharman et al. Had students report to a university office, and to show this empirically in a research study, report to a university office where naive employees interacted with student confederates that were in on the study, right? The next day, the researchers went to that same office and asked the university employees to identify the students they interacted with the day prior. The majority couldn't, and that was from one day before. And they all said, well, we see so many students on a given day, how would I remember? Well, exactly. The exact same thing is true for suspects who possibly even you hadn't, the waitress hadn't seen for several weeks past. You're just another person at the table, right, that they're serving. Herbert Alford is a beautiful example of this. In 2016, Herbert Alford was accused of murder. He admitted, I know the victim. My DNA is probably in the victim's car. However, he was across town at a rental car agency at the time of the crime. And he goes, I know I was there. The rental agency said, I'm not going to cooperate with this trial. Even though the court said, you need to cooperate, they said, we're not going to do it. We're not trying to get involved in this. And Alford was convicted based on his DNA being in the car and a paid police informant who claims that Alford confessed to him. On appeal in 2018, the rental agency finally produced the rental agreement showing it was impossible for Alford to be the offender. So even though he generated an alibi, and it was an accurate alibi, he didn't have good corroboration to support that alibi. So there's various types of corroborators, right? And we've already talked about this to an extent, right? We talked about how Culhane et al. Found that Hispanic participants were more likely to rely on family corroborators, whereas white participants relied more on friends. Both of those are motivated from their others. Are they viewed differently in terms of believability? Also, Culhane et al. Measured alibi consistency. And this is what's more interesting in terms of a generation lecture, right? Alibi Generation. Participants were decent at remembering activities, but they were not great at remembering the time they did the activities. So this means that Alibi Generation is going to have some believability issues to it, right? Which is also a separate lecture that we're going to go into in tremendous detail on. But let's say I asked you, what time did you guys go to lunch 3 weeks ago? You might be like, well, lunch is usually around noon, so I'm assuming we went around noon. And then you remember, oh crap, 3 weeks ago, actually no, we had a huge breakfast, so we didn't eat lunch until like 3. Well, now you're changing your alibi, and it looks like you're being deceptive, right? Let's say the police investigate and find out you weren't there till 3. It looks like you lied to them. You go to the police and say, never mind, I was there at 3. Before the police investigate it, you look like you're lying, right? Either way. Technology is also outpacing researchers' ability to evaluate the effectiveness of differing technologies in alibi corroboration, right? For example, we have Snapchat that lets you see your friends. We have Find My Phone and Find My Friends that allow people to know where you are at all times, right? However, this evidence, it might be helpful, but the advent of things like electronic bill pay may also provide a suspect with an easier route to provide difficult to fabricate evidence rather than paper receipts of yesteryear, right? You're not going to have a receipt, you're going to have things emailed to you, right? So that type of physical evidence could be beneficial, right? But technology is also allowing us to make up things a whole lot easier too, right? And so how believable is that e-receipt that you got from Xfinity, right? Or from, the text receipt I got from Panera when I ate at Panera the other day. Well, maybe that's believable, or maybe people think that it's all just made up. We don't know yet because we haven't done the research, right? False alibi statements can be made, right? And they could be manufactured or fabricated, right? They could be fake, they could be mistaken, but false alibi statements can be made. However, the difficulty in determining true versus false alibi claims is that corroborators have the same relationship to the suspect in both of those cases, right? So how do you determine if something is true or false when you are making up something that could be believable because there's a very small detail change? For example, I was at home with my wife. Well, that could be true or false. That doesn't seem like something completely made up, right? You weren't like, oh, I was ice skating on a lake. Well, no, that obviously wouldn't happen in the summer, right? But also, that's a completely different story. I was at home with my wife could be very true or could be very false. In asking students to provide both true and false alibis in research, false alibis had more changes made after collecting evidence, and false alibis were more long-winded than true alibis. However, what does that mean, right? What does long-winded mean for each individual person? Me, as a college professor, I'm obviously very long-winded, right? And so long-winded for me might be a 15-minute explanation, whereas long-winded to someone who's more introverted might be a 45-second explanation, right? So without some sort of all-seeing eye to look at this, it's also very hard to determine, is that a false alibi or a true alibi? In an expansion of Colhane et al., Newcamp et al. Interviewed recently arrested suspects and asked about their alibis, both true alibis and false alibis. And then they asked the police to evaluate whether the alibi claims were true and which of the alibi claims were false. The police did terrible at distinguishing between the two, being only 60% accurate, which is only just slightly better than chance, right? And so when we ask people to evaluate true versus false alibi statements that are generated, we don't do really any better than flipping a coin. And the larger reason for that is, and we're going to see on the next two slides, because the excuses people use are the same either way. People don't make up these fantastic alibi claims, like I was on a private jet that landed and then I went on this yacht out into the ocean. They say things like, I was at home. True and false people were at home. Shopping, in transit, with friends. Liars and truth tellers both said they were with friends. I was abroad, I was alone outside. Both said alone outside. With family, in a bar with friends. With my partner, only two of the liars in this Newcamp study said they were with their partner, which is interesting because that's somewhat reasonable, right? The physical evidence of liars and truth tellers was also the same. People used phone records to support it, bank transactions, receipts. The same in both groups used receipts, CCTV footage. Even liars used CCTV footage to try and support the fact that they were somewhere else, out getting groceries. They both used computer logs. They both used, right? And so you see here with all of these that liars and truth tellers are generating the same statements. It's just sometimes they're true and sometimes they're not. We tend to think that liars make up lies that are just so out of the norm and outrageous that it would be fairly obvious that they're lying. But it's hard when the evidence and the claims are quite literally the exact same between the groups. So not only can false alibis be generated, they can also be corroborated, right? Obviously, relatives seem the most willing to lie for suspects, followed by affinal relationships like in-laws, and then by social relationships, friends. But Marion and Burke found that in a lab setting, a quarter of the participants were willing to lie for a Confederate in the study after only knowing the person for a brief time. Granted, this evidence was reduced, or this finding was reduced when evidence of guilt was shown to the participant, but still, a quarter of the people were willing to lie for a complete stranger. Evaluators also expect that innocent suspects' alibi stories are going to be more consistent and provide a lot more detail than liars, right? The logic is if you're making things up, you won't have as much detail and you'll have no consistency. The problem is this is contrary to research. And we'll talk about why in detail in the next slide, but this is something that's very, very important, right? And it kind of goes back to the idea from the previous lecture that innocence puts innocence at risk. If the police are questioning you about something and interrogating you about something, the sole purpose of interrogation is to get a confession. So the best thing you can do is get a lawyer. Don't tell the police your alibi without a lawyer present or without doing some research, because if you are inconsistent, it's a sign of lying. If you don't provide enough detail, it's a sign of lying, right? And this can get you in a whole lot more trouble. So why is this finding contrary to research? Well, this is due to a reliance on schemas, right? Schemas are basic cognitive frameworks that help us organize information. It would be impossible for us to remember our calendar if we did not have days of the week. Imagine we just had like the 1st to the 30th of months and that was it. There was no such thing as Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, right? How in the world would you know what day it was to go to class? Like, would you remember, well, today's the 3rd, so I have class on the 1st, the 3rd, the 5th, and then there's 2 days of break, and then what's that, the 8th, the 10th, and the 12th, and there's 2 days break. Like, that would be so incredibly difficult, right? And so we have these cognitive frameworks that help us organize information. So in other words, innocent suspects provide an alibi for what they are generally doing on a night or a day as opposed to what they were actually doing, right? So this can be somewhat problematic, right? We all know that we get random days off for like Martin Luther King Jr. Day throughout the semester, or for Labor Day, or whatever the case may be, right? If I were to ask you in December what you were doing on Labor Day back in September, but I didn't tell you Labor Day, I just said September 3rd, the logic goes like this, or a schema would work like this. Well, okay, in the fall semester, I had a Monday, Wednesday, Friday class. So September 3rd, I'm looking at a calendar as a Monday. It's during the school year. I had class at 10, 11, and 12. So I'll report to the police I must have had class that time at 10, 11, and 12 because that's what I do on Mondays during the fall semester. And that's a schema working, and that's actually generally helpful for how you organize your life. The police then come back and say, that day was actually Labor Day. All classes were canceled. There's no way you were in class. And then you go, oh, well, what did I do on Labor Day? I did. And they're like, no, stop the lying. You should have remembered what you were doing that day. Well, why should you have? Right? It was just a normal day to you, right? Granted, it was Labor Day, but you don't know that September 3rd is a Labor Day. You don't have that memorized, or whatever day Labor Day is. I don't even know what the date is, right? And so you end up reporting what you generally do, not what you actually did on that night because of these schemas. Question type can make this schema dependence even worse, right? Where were you at 9 p.m. or some similar specific time questions are the worst in terms of suspect accuracy, right? Place questions typically are better, but assume a level of investigator knowledge. So 9 p.m. is a problem because let's say my wife and I typically are in bed around 8:45 or 9 o'clock every night. So where were you at 9 p.m.? My go-to is every night at 9, I'm in bed. And that's just what I say right off the cuff. And it's like, really? On a Saturday night when the Florida Gators were playing football, of a 7 p.m. kick, you weren't up watching the game? Oh, well, I probably was up watching the game if the Gators were playing because I would never miss a Gator game, right? Go Gators. Place questions, like I've already said, are better because it allows you to actually put yourself in that place. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in future lectures. But if you say, were you home on Thursday? You then start to kind of think, okay, well, was I home on let me start thinking about that in terms of place. However, for the investigator to corroborate or uncorroborate that, they kind of have to know what you were doing, which means they probably wouldn't be investigating you for the alibi anyway, right? So schema-based responding is an obstacle to innocent suspects' alibi generation. So let's take a college example as a student of this, right? And I already kind of did, right? If I asked you what were you doing at 10 a.m. on Monday, you may use the following logic, right? I have a Monday, Wednesday, Friday class, hopefully with Dr. Behl, the best ever, at 10, therefore I must have been in class. This isn't actually a memory test, though. And that's what's a problem, is the use of schemas doesn't rely on you using your memories. It's a logic test of what you, the suspect, were likely doing during that time and what you, the suspect, are usually doing during that time. So instead of relying on memory for an event, you're logicking through what you were doing. And that's what makes this so dangerous. So Sharman et al. Suggests that alibi corroborators should engage in a memory search to disprove their schema, and we'll talk about this in tremendous detail in a couple lectures, to disprove their schema so that there's not an over-reliance on potentially inaccurate information. So what you should say is, well, most Mondays I'm in class at 10 a.m. Are there any Mondays I'm not? Well, yes, obviously, Columbus Day, fall break we're not, Labor Day we're not. So we need to think through those. Was the time in question either of those days? If not, were there any Mondays I was sick and I missed class? Were there any Mondays I went out of town and I missed class? Let me compare those dates to this date in question. Actively try and disprove what your normal kind of thought process is, and that will help you not rely on this logic test, but rather rely on your memory. So under even the calmest conditions, autobiographical memories are difficult to produce, right? We do a bad job of remembering things that happen to our lives, right? When you add the pressure and stress of being a suspect in a criminal case, these issues are obviously exacerbated because you want to make sure you don't mess up because you do not want to go to jail, right? The problem, though, is unless the suspect is doing something quite memorable, the odds of remembering where one was during a boring day are really, really low. If you were to say to me right now, where were you April 9th, 2016? I can tell you that was my wedding day, and I can tell you every detail about that day because it was the happiest day of my life, one of the best things that ever happened to me, right? If you were to say to me, where were you April 17th, 2020? I would say, I couldn't tell you. Not a clue in the world, right? Because that's a boring day, that nothing all that exciting probably happened, certainly not anything as exciting as my wedding day, and so I'm not going to remember that, right? While a crime is an exciting event for those involved, right, and police believe that we should know what we're doing at all times, the reality is our memories don't work like that. To the police, they're like, oh my gosh, you didn't know a murder was taking place at that time. It's like, well, yeah, unless the murder was live streamed, I wasn't there for it, so it was not exciting for me. I get why it's exciting for the police department. I get why it's exciting for the victim and their families. I don't know why it would be exciting for me unless it was plastered on every TV screen all over America, right? Because I wasn't involved in it, right? And so we're asking folks to perform a mental gymnastics that is literally impossible for them to do. And that's what becomes such a problem with Alibi Generation, right? How we develop our alibis, how we produce our alibis, and how we come up with what it was that we were doing. So as always, it was absolutely my pleasure, and I look forward to talking to you guys soon. If you have any questions, drop them down below.